Hello everyone, it's me, FnafFan Productions if you so please, and welcome back to yet another Stepford County Railway video. So for today's Stepford County Railway video, I'm doing another one of these suggestion videos where I'll talk into the microphone about new features and other interesting goodies that are probably never ever going to see the light of day in the game at all. And my video about future trains for SCR is a living, breathing example of that, considering that I suggested a lot of third rail trains in that video, and SCR quite literally made third rail trains impossible to implement now thanks to version 2.3. Yay. This comment aged like wonders style. This time though, I'm not going to be talking about things like new trains or new extensions and whatnot. And obviously you knew that already because you read the title, but shut up! For today's SCR suggestion video, I'm going to be talking about two of the most highly debated topics in the community: freight and nightly sleeper. To any SCR fanboy watching this video, you know exactly what these are. And to anyone who isn't a fan of SCR, yeah, you probably know what these are in a nutshell. Freight trains and trains where you go to Betty Bye-Bye in. But I'm still going to explain what they are anyway. So Nightly Sleeper and Freight are basically a bunch of proposed new operators that the SCR community, myself included, want to be added into SCR. Nightly Sleeper, as the name suggests, is a sleeper train operator, and Freight is an operator that pulls freight trains. Pretty obvious. Now, the reasons why the SCR community have been wanting these two operators to be added into the game for a while now is down to a lot of evidence, such as freight yards, freight sidings, static locomotives with detailed cabs, and throughout 2021, there are a bunch of leaks that described a sleeper operator. The leaks revealed things like a name for a private operator called Trello, the actual name for the sleeper operator, rolling stock and locomotives, and there was even an audio file for the station announcements that said this:
Nightly Sleeper, Service 2.
Now, the reasons why Freight and Nightly Sleeper are highly debated topics in the SCR community is because, as interesting as they may be, there are a lot of arguments against the two. And the biggest argument against Freight and Nightly Sleeper is that the more you think about it, the more you'll understand that it would be quite difficult and complex to bring these two ideas into the game. And at that time, the developers of SCR were not really interested in adding new operators into the game anyway. A statement that, again, turned out to have aged like wonders. But despite the quite reasonable arguments against Freight and Nightly Sleeper, I decided to throw my hat in the ring in this debate regardless. And I'm going to share my ideas on how I think Freight and Nightly Sleeper could be implemented into SCR and how they could work. Now, before we begin, I know it might sound like a pretty obvious disclaimer, and to be honest, I don't know why I even bother making these at this point, but everything I'm going to be saying here is just my opinion. And a lot of stuff in this video is going to sound very far-fetched and very ludicrous. So take everything I say with a pinch of salt. Of course, at the end of the day, I know that Freight and especially Nightly Sleeper will never come into the game anytime soon, unless Toby decides to take some nose candy again or something.
Toby, what are you doing? Crack? What the pussy?
But it is nice to speculate regardless. That's the fun part about these kind of videos after all. Anyways, without further ado, let's begin. How could Nightly Sleeper work in SCR? Okay, so how do I think Nightly Sleeper could work in SCR? Well, let's start by looking at the arguments against Nightly Sleeper, so that way we can come up with some ideas to work around it. So one of the biggest arguments that I see getting brought up a lot when discussing Nightly Sleeper is the timing. So excluding things like speed restrictions and delays, a typical overnight journey on a sleeper train in the UK takes around 8 to 12 hours. And the longest route in SCR, being the Willowfield to Limb-by-the-Sea route on Connect, takes only 55 minutes to complete, again, excluding delays. So, yeah, it's quite a difference in time. A sleeper train taking only 55 minutes to complete one journey would look ridiculous. But let's say Toby took some nose candy and said fuck it, and he wants to bring Nightly Sleeper into the game regardless. So I think the best way that Nightly Sleeper could work around the timing argument is that we should look at how sleeper trains typically work. Sleeper trains are not just regular passenger trains. They're essentially rolling hotels on wheels, and they require a lot more staff. And so sleeper trains generally have a much longer boarding time at terminus stations than a typical passenger train, lasting usually an hour. And at intermediate stations, boarding usually takes 5 minutes. So if the SCR devs adopted a boarding process for Nightly Sleeper that's similar to how a boarding process usually lasts on real-life sleeper trains, I think the timing problem could easily be rectified. So here's how a typical Nightly Sleeper service would look like to me. The train starts at Willowfield, boarding would take around 10 minutes. Then at an intermediate station that's somewhere like, I don't know, Benson, boarding would take 6 minutes. And then at the terminus, Limb-by-the-Sea, the train would take 10 minutes to terminate. Now let's do some maths. Shut up. 10 at Willowfield, plus 6 at Stepford Central, plus 6 at Benson, plus 6 at Leighton City, and plus 10 again at Limb-by-the-Sea equals 44 minutes in total. Then, if we add that to the time it takes to complete the Willowfield to Limb-by-the-Sea route, this route on Nightly Sleeper would take 99 minutes, or 1 hour and 39 minutes to complete. Yeah, I know, it doesn't really solve the timing problem that much, and it doesn't make Nightly Sleeper very realistic, but I think this is the only good enough way to make Nightly Sleeper work in SCR. With the longer boarding times being added into the game's longest routes, it won't make make the operator too short to be a proper sleeper, nor would it be too long to make players bored. I think it's a good enough middle ground. And finally, I think nightly sleeper could also work in SCR if it was time locked. Now, sleeper trains typically start operating from between 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock at night, and then they stop operating at around 5 to 8 o'clock in the morning. Now, obviously, we can't have a sleeper operator in an SCR being available all day, as it would look very silly and unrealistic to see a sleeper train just casually running around the network in broad daylight. So I think nightly sleeper could be on a time-locked cycle, where it's only available to drive for a certain amount of hours. Taking different time zones into account here, I think nightly sleeper should be available to drive from 9 PM Greenwich Mean Time to 8 AM Greenwich Mean Time. 9 PM UK time roughly translates to 4 PM in American Eastern Standard Time, so it wouldn't be too much of a problem for any non-British SCR players out there who might miss it. Okay, so now that I've talked about how the operations of nightly sleeper could work in the game, let's get into the more interesting things. What routes could nightly sleeper run? And what would the rolling stock be like? Well, starting off with routes, I think nightly sleeper should have 3 routes, running from Willowfield, Stepford Victoria, and Stepford Central to Limb by the Sea. Now, as for intermediate stations, I've seen some people suggesting that nightly sleeper should stop at places like St Helens Bridge and Bowden and Coxley. However, I don't really agree with that, because sleeper trains in real life tend to only stop at big stations. So the places where I think nightly sleeper should stop at would be Stepford Central for the Willowfield and Stepford Victoria routes, Benson, and Leighton Sea. So basically every single major station in SCR. But I guess we could also throw in some limited stations here and there to give the operator a little bit of variety. Like for example, on the Stepford Victoria to Limb by the Sea route, it could go via Morgantown and stop there, and the Stepford Central to Limb by the Sea route could make a limited stop at either Hampton Hargate or St Helens Bridge. And finally, as for rolling stock, nightly sleeper should just basically use any locomotive and rolling stock that sleeper train services in the UK currently use. So the Class 57 diesel locomotive, the Class 73 electro diesel locomotive, the Class 92 electric locomotive, Mark 5 coaches, and Mark 3 sleeper coaches. Now I bet you're probably wondering, could these trains be locked behind the longer trains game pass? And unfortunately, yes they would, as a typical sleeper train in the UK is 16 coaches long, and the longer trains game pass is made for trains that are 8 coaches long or more. So if nightly sleeper was implemented into the game, you'll need the game pass to unlock it. Which is why I came up with an idea to have one train in nightly sleeper that would not be locked behind the game pass. But what train would that be? Well, Caledonian Sleeper runs a service called the Highland Sleeper, where it runs up to Scotland, splits up into smaller 4 to 8 coach long portions at Edinburgh, and then these smaller portions are hauled by Class 73 diesel locomotives to various places around the Scottish Highlands. So in order to get around the game pass problem, nightly sleeper should have one 5 coach long sleeper variant, hauled by a Class 73, costing 1,500 points. This would therefore make a nightly sleeper available for all players, including those who don't have the game pass because they're poor Lamau. And it also means that the longer trains game pass will have more value for money. And overall, that is pretty much all of my ideas for how nightly sleeper could work in SCR. Again, I know the ideas I came up with to work around the timing problem didn't really provide a proper solution, but it was the only good enough idea I could come up with. Alright, moving on. How could freight work in SCR? Okay, so this is definitely going to get interesting now, as we're covering a different mode of rail transport here. Now, before I start talking about how freight could work in SCR, let me address some stuff real quick. As much as I like the concept of freight coming into SCR, I do understand the reality that it will probably never see the light of day in the game. But hear me out. I generally think that there can be a way for freight to work in SCR if we again look at real life. In the United Kingdom, a typical freight train usually pulls at least 12 to 14 wagons. And the reason why freight trains operate at much shorter lengths compared to the rest of the world is down to many reasons, such as restrictions with the British loading gauge, and because of the fact that freight trains share tracks with very frequent passenger trains, they have to operate at short lengths so that passenger trains won't get delayed. And while 12 to 14 wagons is still quite long, many freight companies in the UK operate some service patterns where a freight train can pull much less wagons. It's rare, but it does happen. So if we take this from real life into account here, I'd say freight can definitely work in SCR if the game just adopted those real life practices. So the way I see how freight can work is that this new freight operator can run trains with 8 to 12 wagons. And much like how I proposed for Nightly Sleeper, the game can have one 7-wagon long freight train that won't be locked behind the longer trains game pass, while the longer 8 to 12 wagon long freight trains can be locked behind the game pass. Again, making freight available for everyone, as well as giving the game pass a lot more value for money. And next up, to work around the problem of freight trains getting in the way of regular passenger trains a lot in the game, I think what the devs could also implement in the game are small freight-only lines dotted around the map. Basically, little railway lines that only allow freight trains. I think the best place in the map where a freight-only line can be placed is one that starts on the waterline route to Newry, goes underground just after Farrelly Road, comes back up at somewhere outside of Benson and close to Morgantown docks, and then finishes by joining the Metro and Connect line at Morgantown, where the freight trains will then go to the freight terminal terminal at East Berrily. I feel like having a freight-only line would be a good idea because players can get to run as many freight trains as they want without annoying the other players who prefer to just drive regular passenger trains, as the freight trains won't be in your way most of the time. The only places where you have to wait for freight trains to pass would be the junctions for the freight-only lines at Faraday Road in East Berrily, as well as the signals outside the freight terminals at East Berrily and Newry Harbour. And that's pretty much all I can come up with how a freight operator can work in the game. Now let's wrap it up by talking about routes and rolling stock. Now, as far as routes can go, considering that there are only 3 places in the game that has freight, being the freight terminals at Newry Harbour and quite recently East Berrily, as well as the sidings at Stepford Airport Parkway, I've only come up with 3 possible routes. One going from the East Berrily freight terminal to Stepford Airport Parkway, the second route going from the Newry Harbour freight terminal to the freight sidings at Stepford Airport Parkway, and the final route would go from East Berrily to Newry Harbour. Now, I know there are also freight sidings at West Wyvern, and there's also a huge container yard at Port Benson, which could be a good place for a freight operator. However, I decided to not include those 2 locations in because 1, the sidings at West Wyvern are not big enough for freight trains, and to be honest, the Lynn main line is already a chaotic mess as it is, so I highly doubt anyone wants freight trains making it worse. And 2, the track layout and the somewhat condensed area around Port Benson would make adding a freight line to the port impossible. That is, if you just change the scenery up a bit and change the track layout. So for now, I think the 3 routes going to Stepford Airport Parkway, Newry Harbour, and East Berrily would be enough. And finally, what rolling stock could freight use? Well, obviously, freight locomotives and wagons. Duh. But what kind of locomotives and rolling stock should the new freight operator use? Since there are lots of different kinds of freight locomotives and especially rolling stock. Heck, rolling stock in the world of freight rail goes as far as to reflect the different types of freight trains within the world of freight rail, such as flat cars for containers and hopper cars for minerals. So what kind of freight exactly should the freight operator specialize in? And what rolling stock should freight have? Well, I think the kind of rolling stock that the freight operator should use and what specific type of freight that the new freight operator should specialize in are intermodal freight trains and mineral freight trains. Mainly because of the fact that the Newry Harbour freight terminal is in the middle of a huge container yard, and SCR even has static models of hopper wagons. So it would make a whole lot of sense from a game development perspective if the devs just had the new freight operator running intermodal trains and mineral trains, since the game already has the models necessary. And finally, I just voice cracked. What the fuck? What kind of freight locomotive should freight use? Well, I think the kind of freight locomotives freight can use should be diesel locomotives. Considering that my ideas for freight would be running to Newry Harbour, which is a diesel-only line, and seeing that I've also suggested the idea of a freight-only line, and a lot of freight rail lines in the UK are not electrified, I therefore think freight should be a diesel-only operator. So what diesel freight locomotives should the new freight operator use? Well, for starters, obviously the Class 66, as well as the Class 60, the Class 67, and the Class 37. I also think that the Class 93 could be a good contender for freight as well, since it is a tri-mode locomotive, meaning it could operate using diesel fuel as well as using a battery and a pantograph. And since SCR now has power modes, having a tri-mode freight locomotive in the game could make the new power mode feature more fun to play around with. And, yeah. That's pretty much it. And on that note, those are pretty much all of my ideas on how I think Freight and Nightly Sleeper can work in SCR. Now, while it has been fun to speculate and come up with interesting ideas for how these operators could work in SCR, let's get back to reality. Do I personally think that Freight and Nightly Sleeper will ever actually come into SCR? Well, as much as I'm pro Freight and pro Nightly Sleeper, to be honest, at this current time, no. But do I think that there is a good chance that Freight and Nightly Sleeper could be added into SCR one day? Yes, absolutely. Severn County Railway has seen a lot of transformations in these past few years. The game is getting less cartoony and more realistic now, with more accurately detailed trains and stations. Extensions are being added left and right. Working pantographs are now in the game, along with power modes. Heck, even Tramlink is back. It may be under the Metro colours now, but it is essentially back. The game has definitely entered a new era now, with new features and new gameplay elements. And the devs are definitely not planning on stopping that momentum anytime soon. So in conclusion, while Freight and Nightly Sleeper getting added into SCR might sound very unlikely, if you look at where the game is currently at though, I personally think the possibility of Freight and Nightly Sleeper getting added into SCR is increasingly getting more and more likely. Okay, and on that note, that's pretty much everything I have to say for this video, I guess. What do you think? Do you agree that Freight and Nightly Sleeper should be added into SCR, or do you think it's unlikely that these two operators will ever get added? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I know this is very belated at this point, but thank you for 2,000 subscribers. I really appreciate it, and I want to thank all of you for the huge amount of support and positive momentum this channel has been getting recently. It has been crazy. I love you all, and you are the best. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow me on Instagram and Threads. Join my Discord server. Invite link is in the about page in the comments. And as always, I will see you all next time. Bye!